The river always smelled of mud and wet wood. People tried to avoid this place because the water was deep, cold, and treacherous. The banks were sticky underfoot, and the current was fast. But one man came here every day. His name was Thomas, and everyone knew him as a ragamuffin. He collected debris, pulled out boards and ropes, and picked up rags that had been carried upstream. The boys laughed at him for this. The adults pretended not to notice, and the women turned away as if he were not a person, but a shadow. Thomas lived in a dilapidated barn outside the city walls, ate bread crusts thrown away at the market, and was used to being mocked. That day, the river rose high. The snow in the mountains had melted, and the water rushed with force. Thomas was standing on the bank, pulling a torn rope out of the mud, when he heard a scream. At first, he thought the boys had decided to tease him again, but the scream repeated. Sharp, desperate. Thomas looked up and saw a girl struggling in the water. She was choking, clutching a log, but the current was carrying her further away. People were standing on the bridge shouting something to each other, but no one was moving. Thomas didn't hesitate. He threw off his torn jacket and jumped in. The water was cold, but he swam with all his might. The girl was already going under. Thomas grabbed her by the hair and pulled her toward him. She was light, but the current was pulling her down. He paddled with all his might toward the shore until he caught hold of some tree roots. With great effort, he pulled the girl ashore and collapsed next to her, gasping and coughing. The crowd screamed. Some ran, some remained standing. The girl lay motionless, but after a moment she coughed and spat out water. Thomas covered her with his cloak, which was more like a pile of rags, and held her close to warm her. The people gasped. The girl's dress was embroidered with gold thread, and a medallion with the Duke's coat of arms hung around her neck. Everyone understood immediately. She was the youngest daughter of the ruler of these lands. Thomas was lifted up and taken to the castle along with the girl. He did not resist, but his heart was beating as if he were being led to his execution. At the gate, he was stopped by guards, and the girl was carried inside. Thomas was left to wait. The hours dragged on. He sat on a rock, shivering from cold and hunger. One thought ran through his head. He would be accused of pushing the child himself. That was always the case. The poor man was to blame, even when he saved someone. But in the evening, the Duke came out. Tall, in a heavy cloak, with a tired face. He said that his daughter was alive thanks to him. Thomas couldn't believe his ears. The Duke ordered that he be fed and given clothes. The next day, people were already whispering about him. Those who had thrown stones at him yesterday now said he was brave. But Thomas understood that the gratitude of strangers quickly fades. The castle manager called him. He said that the Duke wanted to thank him and asked what he wanted. Thomas replied that he only wanted a roof over his head and some bread. The steward smiled, but passed on the words to the Duke. Thomas was settled in an old barn next to the stables, given work clothes and a bowl of porridge. For him, it was like a miracle. For the first time in a long time, he slept on something other than damp ground. Several weeks passed. Thomas helped in the stables, carried water, and cleaned the courtyards. No one looked at him with the same contempt as before, but they did not consider him an equal either. He was still a poor man, only now he lived closer to the castle. The girl he had saved often ran out into the yard. Her name was Elin. She smiled at him and brought him apples. Thomas was embarrassed at first, but then he got used to it. Elin said she remembered how he had held her in the water. It was strange for him. For the first time, Someone from the nobility was talking to him like a human being. But the joy did not last long. At the fair in town, a merchant recognized him. It was a man for whom Thomas had once worked as a day laborer. The merchant told the guard that Thomas was a thief, and added that someone who lived like a beggar could not be honest. The rumors reached the castle. The steward began to look at him with suspicion. Thomas felt that his position was precarious, but unexpectedly, the Duchess herself stood up for him. She told her husband that someone who had saved their daughter could not be a liar. The Duke frowned, but agreed to keep Thomas. So the poor man remained in the castle, but ahead of him lay trials far harder than ridicule, because the secrets of the past began to return, and fate had new trials in store for him. Thomas got used to the silence of the stables. It smelled of hay and horse sweat, and in the mornings you could hear the blacksmiths hammering metal. For him, it was the best place. No one chased him away or spat at his feet. He did his work silently, trying to be inconspicuous. But one day, a new squire arrived at the castle. His name was Arno. He was the son of a minor knight and behaved arrogantly. Arno noticed that the Duchess sometimes spoke to Thomas, and this bothered him. He began to joke, saying that the castle had acquired a dog in human form. The servants laughed. Thomas remained silent, but inside he was burning with rage. A few days later, disaster struck. Hay caught fire in one of the stables. People screamed, horses went wild. Thomas rushed inside and pulled out the Duke's stallion before the flames engulfed the entire building. He nearly suffocated from the smoke, but he led the horse out into the courtyard. Arno stood nearby and watched everything burn, but did not move. People saw that Thomas had saved the animal and began to talk about his courage. The Duke heard about it and said that the poor man had shown courage. He ordered him to be transferred to the castle services. Now Thomas had to help the squires, repair the harnesses, and look after the knight's horses. Arno turned pale, but said nothing. At this time, Elin found more and more reasons to talk to Thomas. She told him about the books her mother read to her and showed him her drawings. Thomas listened, even though he couldn't read himself. He told her that the most important thing was to remember how people behaved, not what was written in books. The girl laughed and called him wise. But trouble was brewing outside the castle walls. Raids began in neighboring lands, and the Duke had to prepare his army. Among the knights was Elin's maternal uncle, Sir Roderick. He was a harsh man who despised the poor. He immediately disliked Thomas, considering him dangerous. One evening, Roderick noticed an old mark on Thomas's hand, a burn in the shape of a pattern resembling a coat of arms. He asked where he had gotten the mark. Thomas replied that he did not remember. He had been abandoned at a monastery as a child, and had been wandering ever since. Roderick frowned and ordered him to stay away from the Duke's family. After that, strange conversations began in the castle. Someone whispered that it was no coincidence that Thomas was by the river that day. Arno fueled the rumors, saying that the poor man was actually a cunning thief. The Duke hesitated, but the Duchess and Elin continued to defend him. In the end, Thomas was allowed to stay, but he was told to be careful. Several months passed. The castle was preparing a celebration in honor of the victory over the raid. People gathered in the square, musicians played, and food was distributed. The Duke brought out his family, and Thomas was standing nearby, carrying the banner. Suddenly, a man in a cloak crept up to the square. He took out a knife and rushed toward the Duke. Everyone screamed. Thomas didn't think twice. He hit the attacker with his shoulder and knocked him to the ground. The knife fell. The guards rushed in and tied up the murderer. The people saw that it was Thomas who had saved their Lord once again. This time, the gratitude was sincere. The Duke ordered him to be brought into the hall and said he wanted to reward him. Thomas was embarrassed, but asked for only one thing, that he be allowed to work honestly and no longer be persecuted. The Duke smiled for the first time in a long time and agreed. But Sir Roderick was not happy. He suspected that this ragamuffin was hiding the truth. He began to question old monks and merchants. Gradually, the secret was revealed. Many years ago, the Duke's convoy was attacked on the road. A child disappeared, and no one found him. The boy had a burn mark on his hand. Roderick put the facts together and realized that Thomas might be that child. But he didn't want to admit it. If the truth came out, the power in the castle might change. A hidden struggle began inside the castle. Arno and Roderick tried to make Thomas look bad. They arranged for him to be accused of stealing a silver cup. Thomas was captured and thrown into the dungeon. Elin cried and begged her father to believe that he was innocent. The Duke had his doubts. The steward said that a beggar will always remain a beggar. But the Duchess insisted on justice. The trial was to take place in a few days. If found guilty, Thomas would be disgraced. He sat in his cell and thought that everything was coming back to him. His life had always been a struggle for the right to exist. But this time, the stakes were higher. And it was then that a stranger arrived at the castle, a gray-haired monk who traveled from monastery to monastery. He recognized Thomas. He said that many years ago he had found a baby by the roadside with a burn on his hand and had taken him to an orphanage. He showed an old entry in a book describing the Duke's family crest and the child's name. The monk became the unexpected benefactor who turned the tide of events. The monk's words rang out in the courtroom like the tolling of a bell. People looked at each other. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered that it might be a sign. The Duke sat in a high chair, his face stern, but his fingers clenched the armrest. Elin looked at Thomas with wide eyes. The monk said that in the years when the Duke's convoy was attacked, he was returning from a long pilgrimage. By the road, he found a baby wrapped in a cloak, wounded, with a burn on his hand. He took him to the monastery, but soon the monastery was attacked, the brothers fled, and the child disappeared. The monk had spent his whole life searching for news of him, and only now learned that the boy had grown up and ended up in these lands. The steward tried to object that these were just the words of an old man, but the monk took a piece of cloth embroidered with the Duke's coat of arms out of his bag. He had kept it since he picked up the child. The cloth had the same mark as the old banners in the hall. The crowd began to murmur. Roderick turned pale, and Arno stood with his head bowed. The Duke stood up and approached Thomas. He looked closely at his hand, where the burn stretched in a crooked pattern. And then he said that if this was true, then this man was not just a beggar, but his son, lost many years ago. The hall fell silent. No one dared to breathe. Elin rushed to Thomas and embraced him. Thomas stood as if the ground had disappeared from under his feet. Everything he knew about himself, poverty, ridicule, hunger, was turned upside down in an instant. But Roderick did not want to admit it. He said it was a cunning deception, that the beggar had bribed the monk. The Duke ordered a test. If Thomas was truly of their blood, he must prove that the blood of warriors ran in his veins. The test was set for the next day. It was not a battle, but a test of strength and endurance. Thomas was given a wooden sword and pitted against Arno. A crowd gathered in the courtyard. Arno was confident of an easy victory, but Thomas had been used to working with his hands since childhood, carrying heavy loads, fighting for his life. His blows were clumsy but strong. Arno fell again and again until he finally gave up. The people shouted that the poor man had shown courage. The Duke said he saw the blood of his family in him. Roderick clenched his teeth, but said nothing. From that day on, Thomas was no longer a beggar. He was recognized as the Duke's son, although not everyone accepted this in their hearts. He was given a room in the castle, clean clothes, and for the first time in his life, he ate at the same table with those who had previously despised him. But with this came a new burden. Thomas understood that now he had to live up to expectations. He was taught to read, to behave at the table, to speak at councils. Many thought he was too simple to be an heir. The rumors did not subside. Arno whispered in the corridors that it was all a setup. Roderick secretly met with other knights, plotting a conspiracy. He feared that if Thomas was recognized as the legitimate son, his own claims to the land would be weakened. Meanwhile, Elin did not leave her brother's side. She taught him to read simple words, showed him cards, and told him stories from books. Thomas listened and tried hard. He understood that if he didn't learn, he would be considered stupid. One night, he overheard a conversation between Roderick and Arno. They were talking about a misfortune that would soon befall the castle. Thomas realized that something terrible was brewing. A few days later, a messenger arrived at the castle with a letter from the neighboring count. The Duke went to meet him, and while he was gone, Roderick ordered his men to open the gates to the enemy soldiers. An attack began right inside the fortress. People screamed, torches burned, and guards fell. Thomas grabbed his weapon and rushed to defend Elin. They took refuge in the chapel. When the enemies broke in, Thomas stood in their way. He fought as he had that day in the river, thinking not of fear, but only of staying alive. At that moment, his hidden talent manifested itself. He fought as well as any knight. In Elin's eyes, he was no longer a street urchin, but a warrior. By dawn, the raid had been repelled. The Duke returned and learned the truth. Roderick had brought the enemies. He was captured. The crowd demanded justice. Arno tried to escape, but he was caught. The Duke said that in the hour of need, it was Thomas who had defended his daughter and his castle. And if anyone had previously doubted his right to a place in the family, now there could be no doubt. The crowd shouted his name. Those who had despised him not long ago now saw him as a hero. But Thomas felt no joy. He thought about how much pain the people who had not believed in him had caused him. He understood that power and wealth were not a gift, but a burden that required choices. After Roderick's capture, a heavy silence fell over the castle. People whispered in the corridors, in the kitchens, and in the courtyard. Some rejoiced that the traitor had been exposed, while others feared that the conspiracy was more extensive than it appeared. The Duke ordered Roderick to be kept in prison until his trial, but he himself looked tired, as if his last strength had been drained from him. Thomas walked through the halls and did not recognize himself. Yesterday he was a beggar, and now he was called the Duke's son. But the looks of many remained cold. To them, he was still a stranger. He felt it at the table, in the training yard, even in his own room. The servants bowed, but their eyes betrayed their doubts. Elin tried to support him. She brought him books and told him stories about her childhood when her family was still intact. Thomas listened to her and sometimes caught himself believing that all this could really become his past. But all he could remember was the dirt of the roads, the hungry nights, and the stones thrown by children. One night, the steward came to him. He said that some of the nobility were unhappy with the Duke's decision. Many believed that Thomas had no right to the inheritance, and that Roderick was not a traitor at all, but a victim of intrigue. The steward warned Thomas that if he wanted to keep his position, he would have to prove himself not only in battle, but also in the council. The next day, Thomas was invited to a meeting of vassals. A long table, torches on the walls, tense faces. Knights and senior servants talked about taxes, road protection, and agreements with neighbors. Thomas remained silent. It was difficult for him to understand all the cunning words and subtle hints. Several people openly smiled when he tried to ask about simple things. But at one point, the conversation turned to how to feed the soldiers. Then, Thomas raised his head and said that he had eaten bread crusts all his life and knew the value of every crumb. He offered a simple solution: divide the supplies so that those who stood guard and did hard work were fed first, and then distribute the rest. The room fell silent. None of the nobles had thought of this. The Duke approved of his words, and some of the knights nodded. Thus began his path to recognition. He was not a skilled speaker, but his words came from experience. People sensed this. Meanwhile, Roderick awaited trial. He did not admit guilt and insisted that Thomas was an impostor. He said that the monk was old and could have made a mistake. The Duke set a date for Roderick's fate to be decided. A few days before the trial, Arno disappeared. He was not found in the city or outside its walls. Many said that he had fled to those who supported Roderick. This alarmed everyone. The Duke increased security. On the day of the trial, the square in front of the castle was full of people. Roderick was brought out in chains. He shouted that it was all a setup, that the Duke's real son had been dead for a long time. The crowd was noisy. The Duke stood up and said that the truth would be revealed through actions, not words. At that moment, something unexpected happened. The gates flew open, and a group of armed men burst in. Arno was at their head. He shouted that he would not allow power to pass to a beggar. A fight broke out right there in the square. The guards held their ground, but there were many enemies. People ran away in panic. The Duke raised his sword, but the enemies were closing in on him. Thomas grabbed a spear and stood beside him. Elin huddled against the wall, watching her brother and father fight. The battle lasted a long time. The ground was covered in blood. Thomas fought fiercely, remembering all the years of humiliation. Each blow was a response to those who considered him a nobody. In the end, he grappled with Arno. Arno shouted that he would never accept a beggar as his heir. But Thomas knocked him down and wrested the sword from his hands. Arno fell. The remnants of his men threw down their weapons. The crowd saw that victory belonged to the Duke and his son. The people cheered. The Duke said aloud that fate had decided. Thomas had proven his right, not with words, but with deeds. Roderick was taken back to the dungeon. His supporters fell silent. After this battle, no one called Thomas an impostor anymore. He became the one who defended the castle, stopped the conspiracy, and showed his strength. But his heart was not at ease. He understood that there was still a long way to go. At night, he sat in his room and stared into the fire. He thought that if it weren't for the river, if it weren't for that day, he would have remained a vagrant whom everyone kicked around. His life hung by a thread, but it was a single choice that changed everything in an instant. And yet, he felt that new trouble could be lurking around every corner. Because wealth and power do not bring peace. They only open the door to new trials. After the battle in the square, the castle could not return to its former life for a long time. The cobblestones bore traces of blood, and the smell of smoke lingered in the streets. People walked more quietly than before, and only children sometimes whispered Thomas's name, as if it were the name of a hero from a fairy tale. But he himself did not feel like a hero. Every morning he woke up, and the first thing he did was check if new trouble was waiting outside the door. The Duke convened a council. He said that the castle needed order and a firm hand, that intrigues could no longer be allowed to tear the family apart. Roderick was kept in a dungeon, awaiting his final sentence. Arno was dead, which made the situation easier, but rumors of supporters of the conspiracy continued. Thomas sat next to his father, and for the first time participated in deciding the fate of entire lands. The vassals listened attentively, but many continued to glance at him askance. To them, he remained a stranger, even if the Duke called him his son. Thomas felt the coldness of these glances, but he did not lower his eyes. He realized that the only way to earn respect was to take action. A few weeks later, news arrived. A neighboring baron had refused to pay tribute and was preparing to raise an army. The Duke hesitated. He was old and often ill. Then Thomas offered to go himself and talk to the baron. This made some of the knights laugh. A poor man who had recently been sleeping in a barn wanted to negotiate, but the Duke supported him. The journey was long. Thomas traveled with a small detachment. Along the way, he saw the poverty of the peasants and heard complaints about taxes and cruelty. The people did not know that he was the Duke's son. To them, he was just a horseman in simple clothes. But that was what helped him. He spoke to the peasants as he would to his equals, and the people opened up to him. When they arrived at the baron's, he greeted them coldly. The baron was sure that he was dealing with an inexperienced man and thought he could break him. But Thomas spoke calmly. He reminded him that war would only bring misfortune, while an alliance would bring benefits. He did not use flowery words, but spoke directly, giving examples from what he himself had seen. His speech was not polished, but it had power. The baron was silent for a long time, then said he agreed. The detachment returned victorious without a battle. This came as a surprise to everyone. Even the knights who had laughed before now said that Thomas had a gift for persuasion. The Duke listened to his son and saw that not only his strength, but also his mind was growing. However, the peace did not last long. Soon, news came from the dungeon itself. Roderick had escaped. No one understood how he had managed it. Someone from the guard had helped him. Rumors said that he had gone to the enemies. The Duke ordered the guards to be doubled. Thomas realized that the past would not let him go so easily. A year passed. Thomas was getting more and more used to his new life. He learned to read, trained with weapons, and attended council meetings. Elin was proud of him, but fear remained in his heart. He knew that Roderick was alive and would return one day. That night came unexpectedly. News came to the castle that a detachment was moving toward the border. People said that it was led by a knight in black armor. Thomas's heart told him it was Roderick. The Duke was ill and could no longer lead the army, so Thomas stepped forward. He said he would lead the men himself. No one objected. At dawn, the army marched out to meet the enemy. The field was wet from rain, and the wind was howling. The soldiers were shivering, and not just from the cold. Opposite them stood Roderick, in black armor, with a cold stare. He shouted that he would never recognize the ragged boy as his heir, and that this battle would decide the fate of all. The battle began. Iron clanged, hooves pounded the ground. Thomas fought at the front, setting an example. He felt no fear, only determination. Each blow was like a response to years of humiliation. The people saw him and followed him. At one point, he found himself face to face with Roderick. Their swords clashed. Roderick was experienced. His blows were quick and accurate. Thomas struggled to hold his own, but there was no doubt in his eyes. He remembered the river, when he held the girl and did not think of himself. He survived then because he did not give up. The fight lasted a long time. Finally, Thomas managed to knock Roderick's sword away and strike him with his shield. Roderick fell to his knees. The soldiers held their breath. Thomas could have killed him, but he raised his sword and said he would not repeat his mistakes. He would let him live so that everyone could see the difference between a traitor and a warrior. The people cheered. Roderick was bound and led away. This time, no one had any doubts. The victory belonged to Thomas. When the army returned, the Duke greeted his son with tears in his eyes. He said that he was now at peace. His land was in safe hands. A few weeks later, the Duke died. Thomas stood by his bedside, holding his father's hand, and for the first time felt that he was no longer an orphan. After the Duke's death, the vassals gathered for a council. There, they decided to recognize Thomas as the new ruler. No one objected. The people saw that it was he who had saved the daughter, stopped the conspiracy, defeated the enemy, and kept the peace. Elin sat nearby and smiled. She told her brother that she had always known he was not like everyone else. Thomas stepped out onto the castle balcony. The square was full of people. They were shouting his name. He looked at them and thought about how, not long ago, he had been sleeping in a barn, starving, and collecting rags by the river. Now he stood as a ruler, but there was no pride in his heart. He remembered that it all started when he jumped into the river without thinking about himself. And he vowed to always remember the days when he was a nobody, because that is what would give him the strength to remain human amid power and wealth.